first place. Because if you push the boundaries knowing that your outcome isn't likely, you're going to have lousy outcomes. So, I think in that respect, it's a good thing, but it also creates the potential for misuse. We talk about the business of medicine and the doctor-patient relationship and the unique challenges we face in commercializing something that's a medical treatment. It's difficult. It is a unique relationship between the doctor and the patient. There is potential to do it incorrectly. So we said, Graylage doesn't practice medicine, but my personal, as a clinician, my personal approach was, let's educate the patient as though they were a consumer, right? Because they're investing in this now. We're not going through a third party. So we tell them what we know from research. We tell them what we know anecdotally. We tell them the risks. We tell them the likelihood or potential for success. Go through everything in context. And then, as we talked about earlier, every single patient hears from me, it is possible this will not work. It's possible. We're not perfect. And we say, well, 80% of patients do well over this or that or the other thing based on what we know, but that's not 100.
Yeah, that's good if you're not in the 20%.
Exactly. But they need to hear that, and they need to know that, because they're trying to make a consumer decision now. It's a little different from, hey, let's just run this through the insurance company, and if it doesn't work, we tried it, and we'll try something else. It's different now. This is an educated investment, and we are ethically bound to be fair. And that gets into your original question of price point, right? The physician dictates the price point to the patient. Graylage's costs are fixed, right? For us to produce a biologic, depending on what we do, it can vary from several $100s to a little over $1,000. So relatively inexpensive compared to a surgical implant, which can be $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 or something like that. Just an example. So it's relatively cost effective, and we did that for a reason, because we knew those costs were going to be transferred right to the patient. So we wanted to create a model that was profitable. We have to make money. We're a business, right? If we don't make money, we're not going to be around very long. But also was fair to the marketplace that we were serving, which is, at the end of the day, is the patient, even though we can't practice medicine. So we had to consider the end consumer, even though that's not our client. Our client is the physician. Then the end result, the consumer, is the patient. So we have an intermediary to deal with there. We can control our part. We can't control the doctor's part. But it was in a unique position to be able, as a peer, a physician, to counsel them as a peer. I can't counsel them, as an executive for Graylage Technologies. Again, we can't practice medicine, so we're limited in that regard. So it was a very unique position to be in, and we wanted to provide a good product that, again, was an industry standard, and part of that industry standard was ethically providing the service in a fair way.
For the physician that's listening, and this sounds interesting, what does adoption of this particular technology look like to them? Time frame or space use or bring it into their practice?
Yeah, so we're a little different. So a majority of the models for producing this type of product, and the products we should mention, I guess, there's two primary products that we use. One is called PRP, or platelet-rich plasma. So it involves us taking a blood sample and concentrating some of the cells from the blood and the platelets from the blood into an implantable product that then is used, again, either by injection or by surgical implantation. The second is a bone marrow concentrate. So we take blood from a bone marrow cavity, and in that sample are what we call multipotent cells, or cells that have the ability to promote healing. Mm-hmm. So the platelets release growth factors that promotes and stimulates healing, and the cells in a bone marrow concentrate, for example, also stimulates healing. And I don't want to get too far into the science, but the model of scientific thought changed while we were developing Graylage. And if you think about the standard stem cell model, how do stem cells work, right? The thought was stem cells are placed, they attach to whatever it is you want them to attach to, and then they become that tissue. So in an arthritis model, for example, we inject them into a knee, they attach to the cartilage, and they become cartilage. That was the thought for years as to how these cells worked. Well, that has changed entirely. What we're learning, and this is an evolving process, is that those cells now act as a cell manager, as a tissue manager. Some of them actually attach and differentiate or become the tissue that they want to become. But most of them release proteins that tell the other cells what to do. And that's actually the mechanism that appears to be gaining strength scientifically in terms of how these things work. So one of my colleagues, Arnold Kaplan, coined the phrase medicinal signaling cells, right? So these are active cells. They're sensing their environment, right? What's going on here? And they're releasing signals to tell the other cells how to behave. Well, why doesn't that happen normally? Because there aren't high levels of these cells or platelets in the area. In orthopedics, for example, we deal with tissues that don't have a blood supply. If you don't have a blood supply, these things can't ever get to the area that needs them. So we put them there. And we put them there in doses, right, in concentrations that can have a positive effect. So that's really a premise behind how all this works.
And there's no rejection because it comes from the patient.
Because it's your own. So that created a natural safety profile that we liked, okay, that was attractive. And also, from an FDA perspective, allowed us to move our development forward a little bit more quickly without having to go through the typical pathways that a drug, for example, would go through, which is preclinical animal testing and then several phases of testing. That can take years and millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to do. The Code of Federal Regulations said because it's your own, and we follow a couple of simple rules, we're allowed, it's not FDA approved, we're allowed to use these based on the practice of medicine, so the clinician's discretion. So again, Gray Ledge can provide it and the clinician decides what to do with it. There were two critical features that we had to meet to satisfy the FDA. The first is something called minimal manipulation. We couldn't do a lot to them. There's limits to what we can do to them when they're outside of the body. We can concentrate them, and then we have to immediately put them back in. The second was something called homologous use, and that's a really fancy word, but it basically means you're taking something from the body and putting it back into the body in a situation that it would normally find itself. Well, there's pretty much blood in almost every part of our body, so taking blood from one area of the body, a vein or the bone marrow, and putting it back into another part of the body met homologous use. For example, you can't take a neuron from a brain and put it into a knee, or you can't take a liver cell and put it into the brain. That would be non-homologous use. So we had to meet those criterion, and that allowed the safety profile to be fairly strong. There's still very little adverse events that are reported in the literature or anecdotally to my knowledge. So the safety profile has been good. Now our task is to improve the composition, if you will, the dose, if you will, for a particular patient and a particular indication. So the way we would process a sample for a 75-year-old smoker is different than we would a 23-year-old professional athlete. Or the way we would process with someone with diabetes is different from someone who doesn't have diabetes. The way we would process a sample for a bone is different from a tendon, is different from a ligament, and is different from a muscle. The way we would process for acute problem is different from a chronic problem. And the only way we could determine, or at least move towards that model of precision medicine, right, was to create a platform where we could study the trends that would allow us to make alterations. And that gets back to the original premise we talked about earlier. The first step was measure, then validate your measurement. What you measured was accurate. So measure, validate, okay, and then adapt as we study, right? Measure, validate, adapt.
So the feedback from the patient's critical to know what you're doing.
And the provider has to make the commitment to actually track the outcomes. And we're just getting to that point where we're developing those the platform to allow our providers to be able to do that effectively. I must admit that came a lot slower than I had hoped. I would hope we would have a large database already in play, but it took a long time to actually develop a platform that was user-friendly enough that doctors would adopt it in their busy lives and busy practices.
You know, I think about all of this stuff, but before we go too far, some of the folks are going, well, that's really interesting. How do I find you? So how do they find you on social media?
Yeah, you know, social media has become a job in and of itself, I think, these days. And some of my colleagues